Hi everyone, it's Madeline from Amethyst Atelier. Welcome. Finally, I'm going to release this video. I'm very excited about it. It is a compilation of me making hardcover journals in the past year. And the purpose of this video is to help beginners learn how to make hardcover journals and at the same time, hopefully help small business owners when you're starting learn how to streamline your production. I'm going to share some tips and tricks that I've learned throughout the years and also some secrets that I'm going to reveal. So hope you guys like it. And yeah, it's going to be a long video, so brace yourself. If you guys have any questions or would like me to focus more on one specific area, just let me know down in the comments below. Are you guys ready? Let's go. Here is a quick list of tools and materials you will need to make your own hardcover journals. The items with asterisk are optional. You may choose to use them if they are readily available. Most of the time, these alternatives are more efficient to use, but they could also be more expensive. As I go through the tutorial, I will try my best to discuss each one. Keep in mind that the more features you want your notebook to have, like adding a bookmark or an elastic band for example, the more tools and materials you will need. For now, this list is a good starting point. Just to make this video a little easier to follow, especially if you're new to bookbinding, I made this diagram of a book's anatomy with all the parts we are going to discuss. Okay, so now you know the tools, the materials, and the terminology, we can begin. The very first step is to make signatures. This involves printing the pages and folding a group of sheets in half, usually in groups of 4, which later we will bound into a unit. Printing the pages is only needed if you want to customize your pages to have a layout, like lined, dotted, or grid. If you're making a notebook with blank pages, you don't need a printer and can go straight to folding them into signatures. To learn more about this topic, please refer to my video How to Print the Pages when making your own notebooks, and don't forget to subscribe. Now, back to the signatures. When folding, it is important to remember that you want the pages folded in half to the approximate final size of the pages of your notebook. Make sure you align the pages before folding as well. Here, I folded in half 4 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper to form one signature. This is only one signature, and you will fold the rest of the pages the same way until you have a whole stack of them. This whole stack will make one notebook. Now, here are 4 tips for small business owners like myself. First, to be efficient, I fold and print at the same time, usually while listening to music so the printer doesn't drive me crazy. Second, before I start folding, actually even before I do the counting, I like to check the quality of the printouts. Sometimes printers skip a page or have ink smudges. You never know what can happen, so it's good to check, and this is the best time to do it. Trust me, you want to catch mistakes early on, before you've already spent a long time doing the rest of the steps. This will save you time and money in the long run. Third, to help me count the pages a lot faster, I use rubber fingertips. They're very easy to find online or in office supply stores. Those things are a lifesaver. Finally, to help me fold perfectly aligned pages quickly, I use a homemade folding surface. I made it using a shelf surface, and I taped 2 square sticks perpendicular to each other to form a perfect 90-degree corner, and that's what I used to fold against. Since I made this thing up, I wasn't really sure what to call it, so I didn't add it in the list of materials, but if you make something similar that functions the same way, it may help you fold a lot faster, especially if you're planning to make a bunch of them. The next step is to make a text block. Whereas a signature is a group of pages folded together in half, a text block is a group of signatures bound together. This step takes the longest. It involves marking a signature with holes, punching them, sewing the spine, and finally gluing the spine for durability. First, we need to mark the holes in the signatures. A good way to expedite this process is to use a template for measurements. This way, you don't have to measure where to mark them each time. There are several ways you can do this. One way is to use a text block you've previously made and use it as a template, like what I'm doing here. In this example, I'm punching 10 holes about 1 inch apart. Another way is to use a homemade measuring guides like these ones I made using leftover chipboards. Here I'm punching 10 holes about 3/4 of an inch apart. Another option, if your budget allows, is to purchase measuring tools like this from We Are Memory Keepers. After I mark the holes, I punch them using an awl from the inside of the signature. Then I fold the signatures back again, and because I punched the hole from the inside, the rough portion of the holes could be felt in the back side. Then you put that first signature on top of the other signatures again, you align them, and you use the holes from the first signature as a template to mark the rest of the signature, like so. You might be wondering why we don't just mark all the signatures at once from the beginning, and that's a really good question. I've wondered the same thing. I think it's mainly so that if you make a mistake with your marks, it's easier to change them if you've only marked the first signature, sort of like a test run. Otherwise, if you've already marked all of them and then realize later you've made a mistake, then you'll have to erase all the marks from all the signatures. But it's up to you, whatever works. If you already have a template and want to mark all the signatures at once, go for it. Now there's something I want to point out. It's not really a big deal, but if you want all the rough edges of your holes to be felt outside of the signatures, basically along the spine of the text block, then make sure that when you mark the outside of the signatures and punched it from the outside, you can refold the signatures and make sure that the rough edges of the holes are outside. This wasn't an issue with the first signature because we marked that one from the inside. So when we punched it, the rough protrusions of the holes came out of the other side. Like I said, it's not a big deal. Having the protrusions outside of the signature just makes the interior aesthetically pleasing. Another thing worth mentioning is there are a lot of surfaces you can use to help punch the signatures. You can use a foam board, like what I'm using here, or a serrated cardboard. You won't even have to buy one. If you order from Amazon, you can just repurpose their boxes. In the past, I've also used a corkboard, but over time, those kind of fall apart. Basically, you have a lot of options. You can use anything soft and flat to help punch through the signatures. I usually prepare my signatures in multiple sets and set them aside in small bins. I usually separate them by layout. For example, I have a bin full of lined signatures and I have another one filled with dotted, etc. This helps me plan ahead and prioritize based on demand which set of signatures and how many sets I need to prepare for the next step of making a text block. Now that we've marked and punched the holes, the next step is to sew the spine. For this step, I normally like using the kettle stitch binding method, and I also use an all-purpose thread and a curved needle. You don't necessarily need to use a curved needle, I just find that it's easier for me, but you can also use a straight one. To start binding, move the needle and thread from the outside of a signature to the inside and from one end to the other end. Here I am starting from the bottom up. After reaching the top end, work your way back down again while closing the gaps between the stitches. Once you've reached the last hole, which is also the first hole you started, you will find the needle and thread inside the signature, and there you will tie a knot. That's the first knot. And just to make sure that it is strong hold, I usually do a second knot. After you've made the knots, you need to move them outside of the signature. You do this by moving the needle and thread from the inside of the signature to the outside and gently pulling the knot to the outside. We're done with the first signature. Now we're going to bind the second signature to the first signature. Put the second directly on top of the first and sew through the first hole from outside in. Then over back out through the second hole. Now watch carefully. We're going to loop around the thread coming in and out of the second hole from the first signature. Then we're going to go back in through the second hole of the second signature. I'll do it again with the third hole and this time a bit slower. Essentially, what we are doing is connecting the two signatures together. You're going to do this with each hole for every signature until all the signatures are bound together. I know some bookbinders like to wax their thread or purchase an already waxed thread to help it go through the paper easier. You can try that. For me personally, I don't use waxed thread. I just don't like the residue that it has, but there's nothing really wrong with it. I think it's just personal preference. Keep in mind that you are making the loops around the thread of the previous signature directly before the current signature you are working on. So, for example, if you are in your fifth signature, you will be looping around the thread of the fourth signature holes. Another lesson I learned is that every time I reach the end of one signature, it's a good habit to make a knot or two before starting the next signature. That way, if the thread snaps for whatever reason, you'll only have to redo up to the point where you made your last knot. This step requires a lot of patience. The more you do it though, the easier it will become. The more you practice, the more efficient you'll become until it becomes muscle memory. Don't be discouraged if you find it very hard in the beginning. I think that's normal, and I think the first 3 signatures are the hardest. After that, the rest of the signatures are easier to bind because you build up a momentum, and there's also more structural support to the text block. Keep at it. The more you practice, the easier it'll become. Now we have bound the spine. The next step is to glue the spine for more durability. It also closes the gaps between signatures when you open the notebook. My preferred method is to use clamps and large popsicle sticks. I use them to compress the edge of the spine before applying the glue. You may also use a book press. I used to have a homemade one, but I find it easier to use the clamps because I can move them around my studio easier. I can also separate batches of text blocks that had 1 coat of glue versus the ones that have 2 coats. It just makes it easier for me to keep track of them. Also, I can make a lot more text blocks at a time because I won't be limited to how much I can fit in a book press. I just have to have enough clamps and popsicle sticks. What's commonly used in bookbinding is PVA glue. It is flexible once dried, it dries clear, and doesn't dry too quick or too slow. It's just right. Not all craft stores have PVA though. You can find them online pretty easily, but you might have to do a little bit of searching. So using a brush, I apply 1 coat of PVA glue to the spine, let it dry completely. It doesn't take that long, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. Then you apply a second layer. The next part is simple. Making the end papers, also known as end sheets, and sometimes you'll hear me refer to it as bookends, because that's what I used to call it before I knew what they were called. The purpose of end papers is to provide extra reinforcement to the binding. It adds protection to the inside pages, and it's also a good way to add aesthetic value to the book. For all my journals that I sell online, I already have the end pages ready and organized in a small bin. When I need to make more of a specific journal, they're ready and I just pull whichever one I need. I usually use a thicker kind of paper, like a cardstock, and fold it in half. And there you will need 2 for each journal, 1 for the front and 1 for the back. You can add some lines for personalization at the front end pages, like for someone to put their names at the front. For the end page, at the back, I usually add my business logo. So you can try those too. I personally have a lot of fun customizing my end papers in my journals. I like choosing fun colors that complement the book cover. And I encourage you all to have fun with it. Just be creative. Okay, so what do we do with this? Well, quite simply, we glue the edge of one end page at the front of a text block and the second one at the very back. You don't have to use too much glue, and you can use a brush to help glue just the edge of the text block. To help dry evenly without causing the papers to warp, I like to lay them flat on a surface and put something flat and heavy on top. I have these very thick science textbooks I still have from college that I can't seem to be able to throw away. I find they're very useful to be used as weights, so that's what I use. You can also use bricks covered in paper just to keep your text blocks clean. A good way to be efficient with this step is to combine it with the previous one. What I mean is, since you will already be handling glue when you're gluing the spine in the previous step, might as well do as much gluing as you can together. So like for example here, as I'm waiting for a batch of text blocks drying from their first coat of gluing in the spine, I'm gluing the end papers for a different batch that I've already completed 2 coats of glue at the spine. The next step is trimming the edges and corners. Here you can see me use a guillotine to cut the edges of different sets of text blocks. You can tell they are different sets because the color of the end pages are different for each design. It is possible to do this by hand. For the edges, you can trim the text blocks to your desired size using an X-Acto knife or a rotary. For the corners, you may use a small corner puncher and cut the corner a couple of pages at a time. These would be your cheapest options, but it will take a long time and it would require a lot of practice to learn how to cut evenly and smoothly without needing to sand the edges and corners later. Not very practical if you're making a lot of notebooks. Alternatively, you can use a paper trimmer like this guillotine here and cut the edges. This is a lot faster and it will cut already smooth so you won't need to sand it later on. The same goes for cutting the corners. It would be better to use an industrial corner cutter, which are pretty easy to find online. If there's anything I would recommend you invest to purchase, it would be for a good heavy-duty paper trimmer and an industrial corner cutter. I think it's worth the investment. Advice for small business owners: do not underestimate the importance of doing regular maintenance for your guillotine and cutters. They need to be regularly cleaned, oiled, screw checked for tightness, and blades sharpened. You're going to be using these a lot and you want them at their best when they're performing. Otherwise, it can cause a lot of production delays. The next step is adding a bookmark. This part is optional. You don't have to have it. Although it's really nice to have, it adds an extra feature for your journals. You have a lot of options for different kinds of ribbons you can use. Take your pick. I usually like using these four, especially the wiggly one. That is my signature bookmark that I use for all of my hardcover journals. Now I'm going to show you how I glue it in a text block. You're going to use a hot glue. You're going to make sure that the length of your bookmark is longer than the length of your text block. Then you check for the tips and make sure that they are cut really nicely, especially for the one that's going to be hanging on the bottom. The one at the top, the end that you're going to be gluing, it's okay if it's not that straight. Actually, I kind of like that kind of stringy because it helps adhere to the spine better. You're just going to put a little bit of hot glue at the tip and then apply it and put it on the spine. Gently press it and make sure that it's really there tightly. And don't worry, we're going to reinforce it more later, but this is initially what you do. I pre-cut my bookmarks so that they're just ready for whenever I need them. And I mean, come on, it just looks really pretty. I love looking at this. It's so satisfying. Here are a couple more examples. Moving on to the next step, reinforcing the spine. This step is also optional. You can choose and pick which ones you want to do. It includes adding head and tail bands and also using a cheesecloth. First, let's talk about head and tail bands. You may not know what they're called, but I'm sure you know what they are. You usually see them in the corners here of books and journals, the top at the bottom. Traditionally, the purpose of the bands is to provide an extra structural support for the book and also for aesthetics. But recently, a lot of people are just using it for aesthetics. And the way you can tell the difference is a headband that is there for the purpose of structure is usually sewn on the binding along the spine. Whereas one that is just there for aesthetics, there's nothing wrong with it, by the way. That's what I do. It's usually just glued at the corners. For personalization and customization, I make my own headbands. I just love having a lot of options in terms of how it looks and the different colors that I can have. So I make them myself. And I just always have them ready as well whenever I need them. But you can also purchase them. I know Amazon and Etsy has a lot of options for different kinds of headbands. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to glue the bands at the top and the bottom of the spine. So first, the headband, which is the one at the top, we're going to use a little bit of PVA glue and glue it on top, just right above where we glued the bookmark. Then to make sure it's just really strongly fitted there and for added support for the bookmark as well, I take a strip of bookbinding tape. Then I use it to reinforce the band. Then I cut any extra strings at the edges here, just to make sure it's the same width as the spine. I glued the edge of the cord that I just cut just to close it. Now we're going to do the same for the tail band, which is the one at the bottom. Now we're going to reinforce the middle portion of the spine. And what this does is it gives more support overall in the overall structure of the spine again. So what I do is I normally put some PVA glue along the spine and a little bit also at the edges right here. I try not to put too much because it is going to warp the end pages. So just be careful with that. Try to do this pretty quick before the PVA glue dries. And then the next step is I usually put in the cheesecloth. There are a lot of other ways to do a reinforcement for the binding. This is just my way of doing it. I use cheesecloth and it's not threaded into the spine like I know traditionally that's how you would do it. I think this is the most efficient and cost effective for beginners. I know others also sew the book cloth into the binding. That's something I haven't tried yet, but I am looking forward to learning that as well. Cut any excess. And that's it. That's the end of this step. We are finally done with the text block in its entirety. Now we're going to move on to the chipboard and the cover paper. For this step, we are going to be cutting the chipboard to size, cutting the cover paper or the book cloth, and also gluing the chipboard to the cover paper. Just to help you visualize what we're going to do, here is an aerial view of the text block and also the finished cover. There are three main parts we're going to be talking about. First is the text block, next is the chipboard, then the cover paper. Keep in mind that the chipboard is composed of three parts. There's the front chipboard, the back chipboard, and also the spine. The first part of this step is for us to cut the chipboard to size. And in order to do that, you have to know what size you need to cut it into. And so let's take a look at the text block here. For my hardcover journals, I usually trim my text blocks to 5.5 by 7.5 inches. The way I calculate how much chipboard I need to cut, I just add 1/8 of an inch at the top, bottom, and right side of the text block. There is no need to add 1/8 of an inch from the measurement of the left side of the text block because that would be compensated by the gaps between the chipboards, which I will show you guys later. So if my calculations are correct, adding 1/8 of an inch with the base and height of the text block, Our chipboard's new measurement would be 5.62 inch and 7.75 inch height. So here you'll see me do the measurements we just did, and I like writing it on the text block so I always know which part of the text block is the front. It's going to be covered anyway once we combine it with the cover. If you're making a notebook with a size you've never done before, I think it's a good practice to make the text block first so that you know what the size of your chipboard would be. But if you're making a lot of notebooks and you already done them before and you know the sizes already, then the order between making the text block and the chipboard is not really that important, so long as you're consistent with your measurements. Here you'll see me cutting a double thick size chipboard, which is commonly what I use for my hardcover journals, using a rotary. For me, since I already know how big my chipboard needs to be, I just cut a lot of chipboards and prepare them in bulk, so I have them set aside and ready for when I need them. This is regardless of if I've already made the text blocks or not. I just have the chipboards ready because they're easy to prepare. There's also other options if you'd like. There's a heavier duty rotary, as you can see here, which I got from Art Supply Warehouse. I believe Hobby Lobby also sells the same thing. This is the same tool that they use to cut mats for huge frames. So this definitely will work with chipboards. I usually use the heavy-duty rotary to cut long pieces of the chipboard, and then I finish up the rest with my guillotine. As I go, I also like rechecking the measurements just to make sure that nothing has shifted, especially because I'm making them in bulk. I don't want to have a huge bulk of chipboards with the wrong measurements. I did notice that using the big rotary, the edges are more rough. It's not as smooth as the sides where I use the guillotine. So what I do is I also sand the edges just to make sure they're smooth. I do this part while I'm cutting the corners. Doing this helps the glue adhere to the chipboard, and it also helps the glue spread better in the chipboard so that when you put the cover paper on it, it just sticks much better. It also prevents air bubbles from happening. So you can see here the difference between before I sanded it and after I sanded it. Now we're going to do the spine. Make sure that the width fits the entire spine. You don't have to add 1/8 of an inch on the left and right side of the spine because that's going to be in the gap between the spine and the front and back. When we glue them all together with the cover paper, you'll see what I mean. The height will be the same as the front and back chipboards, so we already have that measurement. I can't stress enough how helpful templates are, and in this step, my advice is also the same. Using templates, if you already know your measurements, really help make your work more efficient. So take advantage of as much templates as you can. Here you'll see me using a template I made so I can quickly make a lot of chipboard for the spine. The next portion of this step is cutting the cover paper or the book cloth. For this portion, all you really need is a scissors, a pen, and what I like to do is use a template just to make it easier to cut. Basically, this template is just a piece of cardboard that already has the size of the paper that I am going to use. So I use my template to put the measurements because it's faster to do it that way, and then basically I cut it. I like using artisan papers. These are papers that are handmade. I just love these papers. They are screen printed and the quality with the texture, it's just really nice. And so when I buy them in huge sheets like this, and I usually need to cut them to size. There's a variety of decorative papers you can use that are really good for bookbinding. I'm not going to cover all of them in this video, but let me know if you guys are interested and I'll make a separate one. Okay, so now we have our chipboard and our paper cloth ready. It's time to put them together. In this part, we are going to glue the chipboard on the back of the cover paper. First, we're going to glue the chipboards on the back of the cover paper. Make sure that the spine is aligned at the center. If you recall, we need to add 1/8 of an inch between the spine chipboard and the front and the back. The way I do it is use a spacer. It can be homemade. For me, I use rectangular steel rods that I found in Ace Hardware store. They're not really made for bookbinding, but I like using them. They're pretty inexpensive. After gluing, turn over and using a bone folder, make sure there are no air bubbles and that the entire surface is glued flat. Then I turn them over again and fold the edges in the corner. I also sometimes cut the edge just so it's not too long, but I don't cut all the way up to the chipboard. I always make sure there's about 1/2 inch to 1 inch left, just enough so I can fold them. It was really hard for me to learn how to fold the corners in the beginning, but the more I did it, the easier it became. You'll get hang of it. Just don't give up. By now, you know that each step in making hardcover journals can take some time. Actually, a lot of time. And so whenever possible, I try to save time by making a lot of each materials needed. For example, if I'm making a cover, I don't usually just make one, I make a lot of them. And that's my biggest advice, I think, for small business owners is save time wherever you can. Here are a couple more examples with my sand dollar journals. I usually like making a lot of the cover papers. Having a small business of handmade journals can be really challenging, mainly because it takes a long time to make each journal. So when I receive an order, I already have the cover. I pre-make my covers, and all I need to do is to pick the text block with the correct bookends and correct layout. I offer 3 layouts for each design. If you haven't already visited my store, you can find it at amethystatelier.com. There you'll see that all of the hardcover journals that I make, I usually have lined, dotted, or plain for each one. And so all I need to do when I receive an order is to match the cover with the appropriate text block with the correct layout. So it's much simpler that way. It saves me a lot of time. The next step is adding an elastic band. This is so that there will be a closure for your notebook. First, we're going to punch through the cover, and then we're going to insert the actual elastic band. After inserting, we're going to glue it. There are a variety of colors and styles, thickness of elastic bands that you can use. I like choosing colors that complement my cover for my bands. The best time to add the elastic band is right after you've made the cover, but before you put it together with the text block. That way, the bookends will cover the inside part of the elastic band. Once you've chosen the band you want to use, cut it long enough, even longer than the height of the journal. Then we're going to cut the holes where it's going to go through at the back of the cover. Make sure you cut these holes at the back, not at the front. If you are cutting through a really thick chipboard, it's nice to use a puncher, which helps cut through the chipboard easier. I use the 1/16 hole puncher. You can also use an X-Acto knife, but it might take longer. This tool that I'm using, it's actually meant for making jewelries, and it's meant to cut through metal, so it's strong enough to cut through a thick chipboard like this. And I use the length of the tool to mark the edge where I'm going to punch. Here, it's easier to show it. That mark is where I'm going to punch my first hole from the top. I poke 2 holes, less than half an inch apart, and use those as a marker where I'm going to cut the rest using an X-Acto knife. Then I do the same thing at the bottom. The reason I do it this way is to make sure that the holes at the top and the bottom align. Otherwise, when we insert the elastic band, the bands will not be parallel to the edge of the notebook. Once completed, I insert the elastic band and with a glue gun, glue the edges to the inside of the back cover. I usually wait till after I've glued one end before I adjust the tightness of the band. And then I glue the last end. And voila, we're done. I usually pair my bookmarks with my elastic bands for each design of my journals, so I have them ready when needed. I usually have my covers pre-made, so when I get an order, depending on if they want lined, dotted, or all I need to do is to pair the appropriate text block with the cover, and it makes fulfilling an order much faster. Another optional step is making a back folder. This will go at the back of the text block. Here I'm going to show a simple way of making a back folder using 2 strips of ribbon and a cardstock. First, I get a letter-size cardstock. For the height, I usually cut it just a little bit shorter than the text block and fold it in half to make sure that it fits the back of the notebook. Then I fold the left and right sides to 3/4 of an inch and then cut the corner into an angle. Now we're going to prepare the ribbon that's going to hold the folder close. First, we're going to fold it in half. Then you were also going to fold in half both sides, resulting into a 3-fold ribbon. Basically, we folded the ribbon 3 times. Then we're going to glue one edge to one side of the folder and the other side of the ribbon to the other side of the folder. Now for the very last step, putting the text block and the cover together, and also the back folder. First, we make sure that the text block is where we want it to be. Without moving its placement, set the notebook down on the table. Then insert a piece of scrap paper inside the end page. This is to prevent the glue from spreading to the other pages. I like using a paperweight and putting it on top of the text block just to make sure it doesn't move. Then I apply the PVA glue on the cover and at the edge of the bookends. Be careful when removing the scrap paper and make sure you do not move the text block. Then you slowly fold the cover back to the end page. And then using a book folder, remove any air bubbles. We're going to do the same thing at the back. Finally, we're going to glue the end folder at the back and then set it aside to dry. A few tips that I think you will find helpful. Make sure that the bookmark, if your notebook has a bookmark, make sure that you fold it inside of the text block and it's out of the way. You don't want glue accidentally touching the bookmark. And also, after you've glued one end of a bookmark, it's nice to put a sheet of paper, or in my case, I use a plastic divider to separate the cover from the text block. Just because when it's drying, it's still kind of wet. And if you let it dry with the notebook closed, it sometimes warps the other side. Here are a couple more examples for your reference. If you guys made it all the way to the end of my video, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know in the comments down below if you'd like me to make any more, any suggestions you can have, or if you have any questions, anything at all, just let me know. Thanks again and see you next time. Don't forget to subscribe.